How could this grand hierarchy of gods and spirits have anything in common with the superstitious mumblings of the black peoples of inner Africa? Wandering among the treasures of the Cairo Museum, it's easy to think of the Egypt of the pharaohs as a civilization complete within itself, owing little or nothing to outside influences from whatever source, entirely its own creation. And I imagine that most visitors conclude as they listen to their guides that a statue such as this of the young king Tutankhamun may have turned very black in the course of centuries, but could not have been a black man in the first place.
The attitude towards me changed completely after I went out publicly and rejected my white classification. One coworker came to me and told me, a white coworker came to me and told me right after the function that he met with the superintendent, and if I don't keep my mouth shut, my educational career is over. And I was told by the director of general education, who is retired now, in '88, I was told by him that I get people angry when I say that I'm black Egyptian.
19e siècle, voici dans le tombeau de Ramsès III, au 12e siècle avant Jésus-Christ, les 4 races connues des Égyptiens représentées sur le même plan. Ici, vous avez l'Égyptien, le type générique de la race, en noir charbon, si je puis dire, avec toutes ses particularités ethniques. Et sur le même tableau, vous avez le type indo-européen, représenté également, avec toutes ses différences par rapport au type égyptien, du point de vue de la couleur de la peau et du point de vue du vêtement. Et ici, vous avez les autres Africains qui habitaient à l'époque l'intérieur du continent, représentés de la même façon que les Égyptiens.
This painting comes from the tomb of Hemaka, clearly a black lady, with a handmaiden behind her, just as surely white.
Both Egypt and Africa are two of the most misunderstood topics on the face of the earth, especially by the general public. This has to do with a long history of outdated colonial views about Africa and Africans.
Egyptians are black. The real Egyptians are black because the real Egyptians, they are real Africans. So those people in Lower Egypt, you see in Cairo, Alexandria, and the Falahins area, they were mixed between the Turkish, Mamluks, French, English, Romans. So those people who come to attack Egypt in that time, they couldn't come to Upper Egypt, to the south, which we still have the same color, our dark color or black color.
The opinion of all the ancient writers on the Egyptian race is more or less summed up by Gaston Maspero, 1846 to 1916. By the almost unanimous testimony of ancient historians, they belonged to an African race. Read Negro.
The Greeks knew Egypt well and firmly believed that the original Egyptians were black people who had come from the south to settle the land of the Nile.
You have such an interesting history. Please explain what made you do a DNA test, and then what happened when you found out all of a sudden that you're related to Ramses III?
That's a great question, Emily. Well, about a year and a half ago, I traveled to places like Israel, France, and different places like that. So what happened was people would always ask a normal question, where are you from? And I would say the States, United States. And the people that I saw in France would say, no, where are you really from? And I said, the States, that's all I know. And so that question stuck with me for a long time. And I just said, where am I actually from? I mean, I know I'm American, but where my DNA is from? And so I said, well, let me take my DNA test. It was a 23andMe DNA test. And I took the test and I was shocked when I saw the results. It came back and it showed that I was actually a direct descendant of the Pharaoh Ramses III. And I knew nothing of the pharaohs. Didn't know much about Egypt, but everything you hear about, Bible stories and things like that. So for me, it was a huge shock, and that's how I found out about it.
I am a black Egyptian. My father is much darker than I am. My mother is lighter than I am. In Egypt, people are identified by the religion first, not the race. So in Egypt, if you are Christian, you are a minority person. But if you're black, you're not a minority person. You are a part of the mainstream society. And I came from this background. And in Egypt, you identify as Arab and as Muslim. And in this country, when I first came, I identified myself as Arab American and Muslim first. And gradually, I became to identify myself as black. I came to the US in 1978, and I became US citizen in 1985. When I became a US resident, I was told by the Immigration and Naturalization that I am white. And I told them that I'm black, and they said, no, in this country, you are white. All Arabs in this country, all Arab immigrants are white. I didn't pay much attention in the beginning to this, because in the Arab world, we identify with our ethnicity first as Arabs, and then with the race second as black or white or whatever. But in this country, you identify with your racial group first and then with your ethnicity second. Gradually, I became black first and Arab second. And I rejected my white classification publicly for the first time in 1987, in February, as a panelist in a function sponsored by the Association of the Study of Black Life and History in Detroit. I said that I belong to two minority groups. I am Arab American and Black American, and I'm racially black and ethnically Egyptian. I was harassed by my employer right after that. I work for a white school district. The superintendent is white, all the associate superintendents are white, even though that we provide services to 30% black population. But the organization is white and the approach is very white. The attitude towards me changed completely after I went out publicly and rejected my white classification. One coworker came to me and told me, a white coworker came to me and told me right after the function that he met with the superintendent, and if I don't keep my mouth shut, my educational career is over. He said, you have nothing to do with these people, you have a history and a culture. These people came from the jungle, you have nothing to do with them. These people lie and steal. When I see one of them in my neighborhood, I call the police. And I was told by the director of general education, who is retired now, in 88, I was told by him that I get people angry when I say that I'm black Egyptian. If I just say that I'm Egyptian, I would get along.
The liar knows what lie he told. You see what I'm saying? So even if I made it deceitful and I made you think that the answer is over here, but the answer is really over here, I'm still going to be looking over here. Me, the one that tricked, because I know this is the right answer. Black people have lost their identity, but our oppressors have not lost our identity. That's just why they chopped those noses off of the Pharaoh and the Sphinx in Egypt in the first place, is because without this nose, we can tell you this is whoever it is.
Who were the ancient Egyptians? The interesting thing about that question is, before the late 1800s, it was well known by scholars and historians who they were. For example, in 1787, in a book called Travels in Egypt and Syria, Count Volney, a traveler and historian among other things, wrote,
"All the Egyptians have a bloated face, puffed up eyes, flat nose, thick lips. In a word, the true face of the mulatto. I was tempted to attribute it to the climate, but when I visited the Sphinx, its appearance gave me the key to the riddle. On seeing that head, typically Negro in all its features, I remembered the remarkable passage where Herodotus says, 'As for me, I judge the Colchians to be a colony of the Egyptians, because, like them, they are black with woolly hair.' In other words, the ancient Egyptians were true Negroes of the same type as all native-born Africans. That being so, we can see how their blood, mixed for several centuries with that of the Greeks and Romans, must have lost the intensity of its original color, while retaining nonetheless the imprint of its original mold."
I think the quote by Herodotus he was referring to was written in the book Histories 2, where he writes,
"There can be no doubt that the Colchians are an Egyptian race. Before I heard any mention of the fact from others, I had remarked it myself. My own conjectures were founded first on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair."
The problem of the most monstrous falsification in the history of humanity by modern historians could not have been posed better than Volney did. no one could have been abler than he to render justice to the black race by recognizing its role as mankind's pioneer guide on the road to civilization. His conclusion should have ruled out the subsequent invention of a hypothetical white pharaonic race that allegedly imported Egyptian civilization from Asia at the start of the historical period. In fact, that hypothesis is difficult to reconcile with the reality of the Sphinx, which is the image of a pharaoh having the head of a black. That image is there for all to see. It can hardly be discounted as an atypical document, nor relegated to the storeroom of a museum to remove it from the dangerous meditation of those susceptible of accepting factual evidence.
What most people overlook when dealing with ancient Egypt and North Africa is the population replacement that has taken place due to several invasions of Africa. North Africa was invaded by the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Arabs. These people are not indigenous to North Africa. In the same way that most modern Americans aren't indigenous Americans, most modern North Africans aren't indigenous Africans. This should be obvious to any intelligent person who knows human history. In the book Travels in Egypt and Syria, Count Voney also wrote,
"Just think that this race of black men, today our slave and object of our scorn, is the very race to which we owe our arts, sciences, and the use of speech. Imagine, finally, that it is in the midst of people who call themselves the greatest friends of liberty and humanity that one has approved the most barbarous slavery, and questioned whether black men have the same kind of intelligence as whites."
And lastly, he wrote,
"There, in Egypt, a people now forgotten, discovered, while others were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences. A race of men now rejected from society for their sable skin and frizzled hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe."
All the gods which were worshipped in Africa, which were worshipped in Sumeria, were actually African gods.
Same with Egypt.
Yes. Ra, even today, amongst the Botswana people here, the name Ra means father. And the oldest warlike goddess was in Egypt, Hathor or Hathor. In South Africa, she was known as Mahato, the mother of the great footprint.
Is that the footprint you showed me once?
Yes. Africa gave the world its civilization.
In 60 BCE, in Bibliotheca Historica, Book 1, by Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian, he wrote,
"The Ethiopians conceived themselves to be of greater antiquity than any other nation, and it is probable that, born under the sun's path, its warmth may have ripened them earlier than other men. They suppose themselves also to be the inventors of divine worship, of festivals, of solemn assemblies, of sacrifices, and every other religious practice. They affirm that the Egyptians are one of their colonies. They have, like the Egyptians, 2 species of letters, hieroglyphics and the alphabet. But among the Egyptians, the first was known only to the priests, and by them transmitted from father to son, whereas both species were common among the Ethiopians."
This quote also relates to what Count Voney said in 1792 when he wrote,
"It would be easy to multiply citations upon this subject, from all which it follows that we have the strongest reasons to believe that the country neighboring to the tropic was the cradle of the sciences, and of consequence, that the first learned nation was a nation of blacks. For it is incontrovertible that by the term Ethiopians, the ancients meant to represent a people of black complexion, thick lips, and woolly hair."
In relation to this, long before Count Voney, Lucian, an ancient Greek writer, wrote,
"The Ethiopians were the first who invented the science of the stars, and gave names to the planets,
not at random and without meaning, but descriptive of the qualities which they conceived them to possess. And it was from them that this art passed, still in an imperfect state, to the Egyptians.
Now keep in mind that so far I haven't made any claims about who I think the ancient Egyptians were. I have simply quoted ancient Greek and Roman historians for the most part, including the father of Western history, Herodotus, who actually went to ancient Egypt.
Eyewitnesses of that period formally affirmed that the Egyptians were blacks. On several occasions, Herodotus insists on the Negro character of the Egyptians and even uses this for indirect demonstrations. For example, to prove that the flooding of the Nile cannot be caused by melting snow, he cites, among other reasons he deems valid, the following observation. It is certain that the natives of the country are black with the heat. To demonstrate that the Greek oracle is of Egyptian origin, Herodotus advances another argument. Lastly, by calling the dove black, they, the Dodonians, indicated that the woman was Egyptian. The doves in question symbolize two Egyptian women allegedly kidnapped from Thebes to found the oracles of Dodona and Libya. To show that the inhabitants of Colchis were of Egyptian origin and had to be considered a part of Sesostris' army who had settled in that region, Herodotus says, the Egyptians said that they believed the Colchians to be descended from the army of Sesostris. My own conjectures were founded, first on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair. Diodorus of Sicily writes, the Ethiopians say that the Egyptians are one of their colonies which was brought into Egypt by Osiris. They even allege that this country was originally underwater, but that the Nile, dragging much mud as it flowed from Ethiopia, had finally filled it in and made it a part of the continent. They add that from them, as from authors and ancestors, the Egyptians get most of their laws. It is from them that the Egyptians have learned to honor kings as gods and bury them with such pomp. Sculpture and writing were invented by the Ethiopians. The Ethiopians cite evidence that they are more ancient than the Egyptians, but it is useless to report that here. If the Egyptians and Ethiopians were not of the same race, Diodorus would have emphasized the impossibility of considering the former as a colony, i.e. fraction of the latter, and the impossibility of viewing them as forebears of the Egyptians.
Aeschylus in the Suppliants has the character Danaus say of an Egyptian ship. I can see the Egyptian crew with their black limbs and their white tunics. This is 480 BCE. He's writing. I can see them. Herodotus says it is a fact that the Colchians are an Egyptian race because like them they have black skin and woolly hair. Aristotle says, speaking derogatorily about Egyptians, say those who are too black are coward, as witness the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. The word too, I translate sometimes as very. You are very, because Aristotle, just quickly, Aristotle was always talking about what the median, the mean. That you have to be not too black, not too white, the mean. And his whole idea was that males were, the Greek males, were more in the mean. They were not too white. They were not like the Egyptians and the Ethiopians, very black. But he used that word because he knew that the Egyptians and the Ethiopians were the same. He was really making a derogatory statement, but it gave us the idea that he understood that the Egyptians were black people and they were black skinned. Apollodorus says that Egyptos conquered the country of the black-footed ones and called it Egypt after himself.
While in the present day, many people claim ancient Egypt was white or it was neither white nor black, ancient Greek and Roman historians had no problem acknowledging that the ancient Egyptians were black. Of course, over time, ancient Egypt was invaded by many different people, as I've already mentioned, but even at the time of Herodotus, which is after at least a couple of invasions, they were still black, or at least a majority black, according to Greek historians, many of whom saw them with their own eyes. A good question to ask ourselves is, if the original ancient Egyptians were not black, why would all the quotes I've just provided exist?
Count Constantine de Volney, during a trip to Egypt from 1783 to 1785, said this, and I quote, he says, "On seeing that head," what head? The Sphinx of Giza. "Typically Negro in all its features, I remembered the remarkable passage of Herodotus, the ancient Egyptians were true Negroes of the same type as all native-born Africans. Just to think that this race of black men today are slaves and the object of scorn, the very race to which we owe our arts, sciences, and even the use of speech." Now, I want to ask this question. What would motivate him to say this phrase, typically Negro in all its features? Could it be perhaps this? This was an artist's conception, Vivant Denon, who accompanied Napoleon's army, 1798. This is his artist's conception of the Sphinx of Giza. Before what happened? Before the lips and the nose were shot off by Napoleon's troops. That is verifiable because Denon was an eyewitness to those lips and the lips and nose being shot off by the soldiers. Why did they do it? We cannot climb into their hearts in the 21st century and figure this out, divine the entrails of frogs, and try to figure out why they did it. That's between them and God. But what happened, happened.
5,000 years ago, this homeland had already become the scene of a civilization in many ways unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. This is where we have to begin, in the Egypt of the pharaohs, in the African land that was the gift of the god of the Nile. It's easy enough to believe, within these corridors built to a gigantic scale and yet wonderfully proportioned, that you've entered a world sprung complete from the lap of the gods. Egypt of the pharaohs was the greatest and the oldest and the most inventive of all the high civilizations of antiquity. And it flourished for 3,000 years. It set a pattern, an example for peoples near and far. But where were its roots, its origins, its starting point? Most of us have believed or have been taught that the glories of the pharaohs could never have been created by African people or African ideas because, it's been said, Africans could never have built a high civilization. Here reigned for dynasty after dynasty the kings who wore the double crown, the combined crown of Upper Egypt and of the Delta. But what had they to do with Africa?
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from a book that I have read twice over. It is from a book called The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality by Cheikh Anta Diop. And to show how the psychology of people can actually go into what they think of people is actually shown within this book. There is an anthropologist at this point in time by the name of Champollion Fignac, and he is a French anthropologist, and what he's done is that he's gone to Egypt, and as an anthropologist and as an archaeologist, he has dug up all of these tombs and dug up all of these things, and he keeps coming up with black faces. It just keeps happening. Frizzy hair, woolly hair, and black faces, and he can't understand, as a white man at that time, why he keeps coming up with these black faces when he keeps digging. Because in his mind, black people are less than him. He's not looking for people that are smarter than him, and if he is, they must be white. And so as an archaeologist, when he writes in his book, this is what he actually says. Finally, after stating that black skin and woolly hair do not suffice to characterize the Negro race, Champollion Fignac contradicts himself 36 lines later by writing, frizzy, woolly hair is the true characteristic of the Negro race. He goes so far to say that Egyptians had long hair, that consequently they belonged to the white race. It would appear from that text that the Egyptians were whites with black skin and long hair. Though we may be unaware of the existence of such whites, we can try to see how the author reached that conclusion. What has been said about Ethiopians and Copts shows that their hair may be less frizzy than that of Negroes. Moreover, a black, completely black race with long hair exists. Dravidians considered Negroes in India and whites in South Africa. If you read this book, what you will find is this archaeologist says, Champollion Fignaik, he says that black skin and woolly hair do not suffice for the Negro race. It does not suffice to categorize a Negro. 36 lines later, he says frizzy and woolly hair and black skin do suffice to categorize the Negro race. So what has happened is his mind cannot get around the fact that these smart black people are actually the reason for these historical monuments, the reason for this historical dynasty and civilization.
Diop was a particularly well-accomplished man. His first career was in physics. He had worked in the most advanced nuclear lab in Europe under Frederick Julio Curie. Diop gave up physics, or really he did not give it up, because he was to become director of the radiocarbon lab in Africa, the first radiocarbon lab in Africa. He didn't give it up, but he decided to use it, to use his scientific accomplishments in order to establish that Egypt was African. And when he presented his thesis, it was wrongly rejected. How absurd! How dare you say such a thing? The University of Paris rejected it. Do you know, the week after he died, the first people to write me from Europe to ask for a copy of the book that was in process, Great African Thinkers, the book I edited on Cheikh Anta Diop? Who do you think wanted so desperately to get that book? And to honor him, and to buy his original manuscripts and to house them? The University of Paris, who had rejected him. Truly, as it is said in the Bible, the rejected one will become the cornerstone of the new foundation. Far more than the linguistic arguments were the other cultural elements. There was the peculiar form of totemism. The totems of the Africans south of Egypt were the totems of the Egyptians. The cultigens, the agricultural things that we find in the pre-dynastic and dynastic Egypt, comes out of the Sudanic agricultural complex. The bottle gourd, the Laganaria caesarea, the gossypium, the special forms of cultivated cotton, Gossypium herbaceum, the oil palm fruit, the tamarind fruit, the watermelon, all of these things are African. If somebody else was coming in civilizing Egypt, where are their cultigens? And then people created a pyramid building race who came into Egypt and built pyramids. Then where are their pyramids? Where did they learn this extraordinary? You will hear something so astonishing about the pyramids. You will realize why it is that there has been so much dispute about Egypt. Because what the Egyptians did, few of us really know how remarkable it is.
How could this grand hierarchy of gods and spirits have anything in common with the superstitious mumblings of the black peoples of inner Africa? Wandering among the treasures of the Cairo Museum, it's easy to think of the Egypt of the pharaohs as a civilization complete within itself, owing little or nothing to outside influences from whatever source, entirely its own creation. And I imagine that most visitors conclude as they listen to their guides that a statue such as this, of the young king Tutankhamun, may have turned very black in the course of centuries, but could not have been a black man in the first place. It's a view which is now increasingly under challenge, not least from African historians and archaeologists. One of the more outspoken of these is Professor Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal, who has made a special study of the origins of the people of ancient Egypt.
19e siècle, voici dans le tombeau de Ramsès III, au XIIe siècle avant Jésus-Christ, les 4 races connues des Égyptiens représentées sur le même plan. Ici, vous avez l'Égyptien, le type générique de la race, en noir charbon, si je puis dire, avec toutes ses particularités ethniques. Et sur le même tableau, vous avez le type indo-européen représenté également, avec toutes ses différences par rapport au type égyptien, du point de vue de la couleur de la peau et du point de vue du vêtement. Et ici, vous avez les autres Africains qui habitaient à l'époque l'intérieur du continent représentés de la même façon que les Égyptiens.
That particular painting, however, is a rare exception, the only one, as far as I know, that so clearly makes the professor's point. For the most part, the ancient Egyptians had themselves portrayed as reddish pink, but of course they intermarried with Asians, and even more with other Africans. Many of their noble ladies were Nubians and lovingly portrayed as such. This painting comes from the tomb of Hemaka, clearly a black lady, with a handmaiden behind her, just as surely white.
Both Africa and Egypt are two of the most important locations in all the world. Africa is the birthplace of mankind. It's the birthplace of mathematics, art, and many other tools and traits that are fundamental to all humanity. And Egypt is one of the most influential civilizations on the face of the earth. Our measurement of time comes from Egypt. All alphabets come from Egypt. There's a countless number of really important things invented in Egypt. So it's very important to African history and to African people. Both Egypt and Africa are two of the most misunderstood topics on the face of the earth, especially by the general public. And this has to do with a long history of outdated colonial views about Africa and Africans.
Egyptians are black. The real Egyptians are black because the real Egyptians, they are real Africans. So those people in Lower Egypt, you see in Cairo, Alexandria, and the Falahins area, they were mixed between the Turkish, Mamluks, French, English, Romans. So those people who come to attack Egypt in that time, they couldn't come to Upper Egypt, to the south, which we still have the same color, our dark color or black color.
The opinion of all the ancient writers on the Egyptian race is more or less summed up by Gaston Maspero, 1846 to 1916. By the almost unanimous testimony of ancient historians, they belonged to an African race, read Negro, which first settled in Ethiopia on the Middle Nile. Following the course of the river, they gradually reached the sea.
It followed that the royal children were often black as well, as was King Senusret, seen here wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. Or this pharaoh, of unknown name, but obviously of high prestige in his time, and just as clearly African. Elephantine Island in the Nile marked the border between Egypt and Nubia, and was a place of great sanctity in ancient times. Among the travelers who came here were the earliest European historians, the Greeks, men like Herodotus, brought up as he was in the classical tradition which regarded the various races of the known world as different but equal. The Greeks knew Egypt well and firmly believed that the original Egyptians were black people who had come from the south to settle the land of the Nile. But Herodotus himself got no further than this. He was prevented by the first cataract from travelling further south. And so he never saw the huge temple which Ramesses II chose to build here at Abu Simbel, further south into inner Africa than any other great monument built by the pharaohs to celebrate their power. A few years ago, with immense ingenuity, the entire structure was lifted to a new site, above the artificial lake which has drowned all the sites of the most ancient kingdoms that flourished here in Nubia, even before the first of the pharaohs. But why should he have built this great temple so far to the south? Perhaps because his queen, Nefertari, was herself a Nubian. And also because these were the people of the south, whom he wanted to impress with evidence of the prisoners he'd taken in faraway Syria and Asia Minor. Even mighty temples like this one have to be seen against the background origins of ancient Egyptian civilization. And those origins, in the light of modern science, were above all African. No matter what ideas or customs the pharaohs may have found in the Asian lands they conquered, Egypt's beginnings were in the south, in this inner Africa, which the ancient Egyptians called the land of the gods, of the African gods whom they revered as their guardian spirits.
Unfortunately, the African identity of ancient Egypt was gradually erased in art, in textbooks, and in mainstream history. In other words, it was whitewashed, and Egypt was then framed as not even being African and recast as somehow Mediterranean or even Middle Eastern. This distortion only worked to support colonial agendas. The idea was that if Africans never created any great civilizations, then it was okay to enslave them. In fact, the enslavers would be doing them a favor. They called this the white man's burden. And they had to tell themselves that the ancient Egyptians were dark-skinned Caucasian, and if any black people were in Egypt, they were only there as slaves. What I find interesting about all this is when someone claims that ancient Egypt was originally a black African civilization, they get called an Afrocentrist. And yet, people who use that term never say anything about Eurocentrism, which is actually responsible for many lies that we have been told about human history, which put white people at the center of any great civilization, whether it was in Africa, China, or India. However, through all the lies told about human history, the truth has always found ways of coming out.
The liar knows what lie he told. You see what I'm saying? So even if I made it deceitful and I made you think that the answer is over here, but the answer is really over here, I'm still going to be looking over here. Me, the one that tricked, because I know this is the right answer. Black people have lost their identity, but our oppressors have not lost our identity. That's just why they chopped those noses off of the Pharaoh and the Sphinx in Egypt in the first place, is because without this nose, we can tell you this is whoever it is. But with that nose, it can only be. Why would somebody vandalize a whole face and only vandalize one part? Nobody wanted to knock an eye off or take an ear off or no chins missing. No, just the nose. Because it's a brand. It's a brand.